And in my discussions which followed with the MOD representatives, they specified a replenishment problem. In addition to solving the immediate problem of getting the Hawks, the original number of which was to be 120, moved from Israel through a European country and then on to Iran, there was the problem of replenishing the TOWs which had been shipped in August, September. As I recall, I made a number of telephone calls to the Department of Defense, to my point of contact. I think it was at that point either Mr. Cook or General Powell, trying to ascertain the cost of a Hawk system, the cost of a TOW system. There was a rather protracted period of time in which all of this was worked out. I also took, at that point in time, a decision with the approval of Admiral Poindexter and Mr. McFarland, and asked General Secord to fly to Europe to see what he could do to straighten out the mess. My recollection is General Secord was reluctant to do that. He was already busy with another covert operation, which I'm sure you'll want to talk about. And he was up to his ears in alligators. He nonetheless went. There were a series of meetings he had with Israeli representatives in Europe, then in Israel. And at some point in the next, between the 17th and the 24th, I believe, he asked me for the name of a proprietary, or actually what he asked me for is, does Langley know of any discrete airlines that can provide the services that the Israelis were going to provide themselves? And basically it was an air support problem that had been developed. The reason I asked General Secord to go is he had contacts in the European country that they were planning to move these things through because of the other covert operation. He had a lot of experience in the aviation business and fixing aviation problems, particularly covert ones. And he was an expert on Iran. And so he went, met with the Israelis, met with a number of officials in the European country. The long and the short of it was I got the name of a proprietary from the CIA. The proprietary was passed to General Secord, and he contracted with the proprietary to pick up the Hawks. The aircraft flew to Israel, then flew in a circuitous route to Iran, and delivered the Hawks. I believe the actual delivery took place on or about the 24th or 25th of November. More?
Yeah, I'll come back to some of these issues, but I take it there was originally contemplated to ship more than 18 Hawks.
The original number as I remember, the original number I was told was 80, and then I was told later on that it was 120, and 120 sticks in my mind as being the number that was eventually determined that was intended to be shipped. And I think that we had some confirmation that that was the arrangement through sensitive intelligence.
And can you tell us the story of why only 18 were shipped?
It's a bit of a horror story. The original plan, as had been worked out by the Israelis, would have put, as I recall, either 40 or 80 on a 747 cargo jet, and that would offload in a European country, then reload onto other aircraft. General Secord said, that's not going to work. It's going to be too visible to people. Let's move the stuff out of Israel directly. He worked that out with the Israelis, and only 18 could be put into the kind of aircraft that was provided, because apparently the configuration of the door, I defer to experts on loading airplanes for exactly what the problem was, but it was, I think, a loading problem more than anything else. They'd only allowed 18 to be loaded at once.
Well, that explains why only 18 went at one time, but why weren't the rest of them shipped later?
To coin a phrase, I think the Iranians went ballistic when they saw what they got. And the reason they did so is they had apparently been told by the Israelis that they were getting a system that would shoot down Soviet and Iraqi high-altitude aircraft. And the Hawk system is not a high-altitude weapon system. It is a low-altitude defensive weapon system. And apparently they felt that they had been misled. Now, having not been a party to whatever the Iranians were told, either by Mr. Ghorbanifar or Mr. Nimrati or Mr. Schwimmer, General Secord was obviously concerned that someone had misled the Iranians at the far end, and they were very upset. I mean, we could see that in sensitive intelligence. They apparently disassembled one of the 18 Hawks, noticed that it did not meet what they had. In fact, it was the same as what they already had in their inventory from the United States, and were very, very concerned. We became concerned at that point, or at least I did, that because of the commitments that had been made for something other than what was delivered, that we were indeed, instead of rescuing hostages, creating a situation in which they were being placed at increasing risk because of potential reprisals or something like that. And at that point in time, a proposal was developed by which we would take these activities and exert more control over them and management over them. And that you just couldn't have people making commitments for American lives in faraway places and creating a situation where those who were supposedly helping to influence their release would think we were being just cheating on them, is the word that was used frequently in the sensitive intelligence.
I'd like to go back over some of the issues arising out of this Hawk transaction. The first one I'd like to address, Colonel North, is the issue of money. And I think the best place to begin is with an item out of your notebook, spiral notebook, and I believe you'll find it in exhibit book number 3. There are some documents collectively marked exhibit 69A. I would like you to turn, they're in date order, and I'd like you to turn to one which bears the date of 18 November. And there are a number of those. You have to look for one which at the top of the page says Israeli account Credit Suisse. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
I'd like you to take a look at the middle of the page. It says Secord to call a city in a foreign country.
Yes.
Then underneath that it says Ben Youssef, start buy orders at $14 million or less.
Right.
While we're on that, that's the Ben Youssef is the person at the Israeli purchasing office, I take it.
He is.
And the suggestion to buy at $14 million or less has to do with the reporting requirements under the Arms Export Control Act.
That's correct.
The idea being if it's under $14 million, you don't have to report to Congress.
Someone had told me that. That's right.
And then under that it says Schwimmer move $1 million to Lake.
Right.
Now, Lake is Lake Resources. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was Schwimmer to move $1 million to Lake for?
It is my recollection that the intention was to use that for the purpose of carrying out this whole activity.
Well, what activity?
the movement of the Hawks to Iran.
From where?
Israel. There may have been, at that point in time, I may have made enough phone calls to figure out that we were going to try and move stuff from the United States to replenish. I think the replenishment problem had been identified for me at that point, that I clearly understood I clearly understood that the Israelis perceived that we had made a commitment to replenish their supplies. It was made very clear to me that the numbers of weapons were an issue for them and that they needed replenishment in very short order. I did not know at that point in time exactly what commitment had been made. Mr. McFarlane was still out of the country. I was being told by the Israelis that they had national security implications as a consequence of this, and that they expected a prompt and full replenishment.
Now, right underneath Schwimmer move $1 million to Lake are the words Schwimmer to pick up Hawks in U.S. What is that a reference to?
I guess, and I don't remember the point in time or who I was talking to, my guess is that that's where he's buying the replacements.
I need to ask this again. Why is $1 million being put into the Lake Resources account?
As I recall, the intention of that $1 million was to cover the cost of this whole transaction in terms of renting airplanes and warehouse space and the appropriate charges for various people on the ground, those kinds of things. That was my understanding of it.
Whose idea was it that $1 million for that purpose would be put into the Lake Resources account?
I don't recall. It was probably arrived at mutually among General Secord, the Israelis, and I.
Now,
I'm not sure who actually originated the figure, or I'm sure that the Lake Resources account was one that was known to me, and since he was going to be the one that was the charter agent, my sense is it was kind of mutually arrived at. We were very concerned that they had demonstrated a certain ineptness in trying to pull this whole thing off.
General Secord has testified in front of this committee that he left for the foreign country, European country, on the 19th, that either that day or the 18th was the first time he was contacted, and that it was his job at that point in time to do nothing other than facilitate the obtaining of landing rights for Israeli aircraft in the foreign European country, and that it wasn't until sometime after he arrived in the foreign country that he had any responsibilities at all having to do with transporting arms. Is your recollection different from his?
Not necessarily. I'm just saying that I thought maybe I had contacted General Secord as early as the 17th after I'd been contacted by Mr. McFarlane and the Israelis. And my sense is that that's how this whole thing evolved. That there was a consideration to have us take over the management of this thing, that it was royally fouled up, and to fix it. And that right there would be the funds necessary to make this transaction work.
Are you referring now, when you say this